I'm Jim. This is the Film Experience, and welcome to my darkroom. As you've probably guessed, this week's camera is the Minox, also known as the spy camera. If you've seen James Bond movies or any of the popular spy thrillers, you've seen these cameras in use. It's not just a movie trope, though. These cameras are very real, and they were expressly made for one purpose only: espionage. In fact, it may still be illegal in some countries to even have one of these in your possession. I want to talk a little bit about the camera itself, but at the end I'm going to give you some true stories about the Minox, including how it played a key role in ending the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where East and West came dangerously close to nuclear conflict. More on that in a bit. First, let's talk about the camera. The Minox is a tiny, very high quality camera that is specifically designed for covertly capturing images, and it was easy to conceal. The camera was developed by Walter Zapp in 1936 and quickly became standard equipment for spies and intelligence agencies around the world. The story of the Minox camera started in the 1920s when Walter Zapp began experimenting with miniature cameras. Zapp was born in Latvia in 1905. He studied optics and photography in Germany. In the mid-1930s, Zapp had developed a camera that was small enough to fit into the palm of the hand. But it still produced very high quality images. Zapp patented his design and founded the Minox company in 1937. And the Minox company continued until the 2000s, early 2000s. So the Minox camera quickly gained a reputation as a high-quality precision instrument that was soon adopted by intelligence agencies around the world, including Europe, the United States, and Great Britain. It was used by the British Secret Service, the American CIA, the Russian KGB, among numerous other agencies. During World War II, the Minox camera was used extensively by spies on both sides of the conflict. German spies used the camera to capture images of Allied positions and troop movements, while Allied spies used it to gather intelligence on German military installations. After the war, the Minox camera continued to be used by intelligence agencies around the world, especially during the Cold War, where it was used extensively on both sides of the Iron Curtain. In the decades that followed, the Minox company continued to innovate and improve its cameras. In the 1950s and 60s, the company introduced new models with improved optics and features such as, in this one, light meters and automatic exposure control. Today, the Minox camera remains a popular choice among collectors and enthusiasts who appreciate its very innovative design and its incredibly cool history. Now let's take a close-up look at the camera. So let's take it over to the workbench. Okay, so let's take a look at the camera. So I want to give you just a little bit of a tour of its features. So as you can see, it's very small. Right on the top end, we have a flash socket. You could actually attach a flash unit to it. It has a tripod socket on the bottom. And then on the body of the camera itself, we have a couple of lights here. So if I flick this over to the side, you can see this green light comes on. That's a battery check. And if I slide this little switch to the other direction, it's currently telling me that it will take a photo. Because that orange light is lit, it tells me it will record a photo, but it's going to need a tripod, or it's going to be a long exposure. And then the light next to it is the overexposure. So if I pass this little meter button to the back to take a meter reading, if the red light lights up, then it's going to be overexposed. And I can select my exposures anywhere from 1/30th of a second all the way to 2,000th of a second on the shutter speed dial. So that little switch that I'm using is called the check switch. Then below the shutter speed dial, we have the exposure counter, and measuring the how many frames have been used on the film. And as I mentioned moments ago, this the film can hold up to 50 exposures per roll. The focusing scale is located right here, and you can dial in by turning it. I can dial in infinity or any of a variety of different focusing distances, and those distances I'll explain in just a moment. There's the shutter release button, and the camera, when it's closed like this, you'll notice the lens window here is actually covered. And there's also the meter window right here. And when I open the camera up, it exposes the viewfinder window. There's also a little slide right here that slides a neutral density filter. Not sure if you can see that. Slides that filter across the lens. And then on the back is the viewfinder. Underneath is the ISO setting. When you take a photo with the Minox, it's normally stored closed. When you take the photo, you pull it to open it up. Using the viewfinder, you compose your image, set your settings, press the release, and then close it. And if you're going to take a second exposure, pull it open again, and opening it advances to the next roll of to the next frame. Older versions of the Minox will do that even if an exposure hasn't been taken. So I would have just wasted 2 exposures on an older Minox. This is the Minox LX, and on this one it didn't have that issue. So it only advances the film after an exposure has been taken. So that's the camera. But then there's this little thing, the chain. What's that? There's nothing special about the chain with most cameras, but with this camera it's actually a very, very important function. So with the camera in its case, the chain plays a very critical role when photographing documents. In the little video at the beginning, you may have seen me taking pictures with taking the photos with the camera. And I had the camera open, and I was measuring the distance to the document with the chain. So on the chain there are these little beads, and each bead corresponds to a distance on the focus scale. So if I'm on the 4th bead, then that tells me which number to use on the focus scale to ensure that I'm getting a very accurate, very clear focus, which is extremely important when recording documents. So the chain is very much a part of the camera's function. So that is the Minox. The camera uses 8x11 subminiature film, which is 9.2 millimeters wide in a cartridge and can provide up to 50 exposures per roll in that cartridge. Minox film can still be purchased today. Here in Canada, Vancouver's Beau Photo currently carries it as a stock item. In the USA, Blue Moon Camera in California supplies the film. There's likely other sources as well, and if you know of any, please mention them in the comments. Film and processing does tend to be a bit expensive, so there is also a do-it-yourself option. You can home develop Minox film. I've had success using Rodinol, or here in Canada, Blazonol, for 9 minutes in a 1:25 dilution. Many say that it's likely just Delta 100 or Rolly RPX 100 film that's been repackaged So you should be able to try any developer for those films. As for the film itself, my personal preference is to roll my own film. I like to use Ilford Ortho because it can be handled in safe light, which makes tray processing very easy. There are also special Minox development processing tanks that can process in the daylight that are available. You can also modify standard Patterson spools or even 3D print your own Minox development spools to fit into your Patterson daylight tanks. There's many options. Now, obviously you can't put 35mm film in here, so you need to cut it down to 9.2mm, and that's easily done using a Minox film slicer like this one. And this is one that I 3D printed myself. And you feed in 35mm on one side, out of the other side comes 9.2mm Minox film, 2 strips of it that can be cut down to make 4 or 8 rolls of Minox film. Those need to get inserted into Minox cartridges, and you can get those either by shooting actual cartridges of Minox film, developing the film and getting the spool returned to you empty, or you can buy empty spools from Blue Moon Camera in California. Empty cartridges, I should say. There's even a 3D printed Minox cartridge if you want to try doing that on your own. I'll leave links to all of these things down below. Now let's talk about the fun part, the history. The Minox spy camera played a significant role in quite a few historic events involving espionage and intelligence gathering. In fact, there's so many that you could literally write a book on the subject. I've gathered a couple true and well-documented stories just to whet your appetite. First involves a CIA agent named Robert Waller. He was a CIA agent in the 1960s and was known for his innovative use of the Minox camera. In one situation, he disguised himself as an old man with a cane. Very unique cane. It actually had a Minox embedded into the handle, and he was able to trigger it remotely. Waller was able to wander East Berlin, capturing valuable images of military installations, troop movements, and other sensitive information. The cane camera was a highly effective tool for espionage because it allowed him to wander around taking photos without attracting any attention. He was able to gather valuable intelligence about Soviet military activities, which was then used by the CIA. Waller also managed a network of Soviet officials back in the USSR who had been persuaded to provide information to the West. He often communicated with them via messages left in dead drops, and he would later return to that dead drop to recover a tube of Minox film. One of the most famous incidents involved the Minox camera in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. U-2 spy planes had been flying over Cuba and the USSR, and they'd been used to take high-altitude photographs of Soviet missile sites. However, the U-2 flights were suspended after one of the planes was shot down by a Soviet missile. Its pilot was taken into custody, and around that time, world tensions built as the USSR started to deploy nuclear missile installations in Soviet-controlled Cuba in striking distance of the USA. Clashes between East and West put the world on edge. All-out nuclear war was seen by many as an absolute certainty. During this period of time, in 1962, a KGB agent named Oleg Penkovsky began secretly providing intelligence to the United States and Great Britain. Penkovsky was a colonel in the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, and he was providing highly classified information about Soviet military capabilities and strategic plans to the West in hopes of preventing his country from ending up in all-out nuclear war. To smuggle the information out of the Soviet Union, Penkovsky used a variety of methods, including the use of a Minox. In some cases, Penkovsky would photograph documents with the camera and then hide them in a hollowed-out book. The book was then given to a British courier, who was able to get it back to the West. In other cases, film and documents were deposited in dead drop sites, where they were later retrieved by British or American agents. The information provided by Penkovsky was highly valuable to the US and British governments. His stolen documents showed that the Soviet nuclear arsenal was significantly smaller and weaker than they had been claiming. Additionally, the files revealed that the Soviet guidance systems were not even functional, and neither were their fueling systems for their missiles. This information proved very useful, allowing U.S. President John F. Kennedy to call the bluff of Nikita Khrushchev. This resulted in a Soviet withdrawal of missiles and peaceful resolution to the crisis. Many credit Penkovsky as the man who stopped nuclear war. The Minox camera was an indispensable tool that made that possible. Unfortunately, Penkovsky's activities were eventually discovered by the KGB, and in 1963 he was executed for treason. Well, that concludes this introduction to the Minox. As you can see, it's not just a really cool camera, but an amazing piece of history. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to make sure you catch future videos, including one where we're going to talk about the Japanese Micro, the spy camera used by the Japanese to survey Pearl Harbor prior to the attack. I read all your comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm not an expert on the Minox or on Soviet military history, so if I've missed anything, or if you know of any interesting stories yourself involving the Minox, please be sure to share them in the comments. Thanks for watching.